In the winter of 1871, the first storm swept across the Wyoming territory, dragging ice-screaming winds and something no one could have expected. In a lonely valley near Lander, Caleb Thomas's cabin stood like a single low note pressed into the endless white. He was used to long, silent nights, used to the wind howling through the roof beams, used to solitude. But that night, as he was driving his cattle in under the black sky, he heard something else. A flash of lightning splitting the mountain ridge, and then another sound, something heavy crashing down into the snow. He swung onto Scout and cut through the blizzard. And then he saw a stagecoach overturned one wheel, splintered, half buried in drifts. And someone lying still in the snow. Caleb swung down, crouched. Auburn hair covered her face. Her fine eastern dress was caked with ice, a dark stain spreading across the fabric. But her hands clutched a leather satchel, like it was her last breath. He slipped his arms under her and lifted her. She weighed nothing. She was ice cold. That night through the storm, Caleb rode back to the cabin, not knowing who he'd just saved, and not knowing that from that moment on, nothing in his life would ever be the same. That winter came early to Wyoming, colder and harsher than most years. Across the snow-covered slopes of the Wind River Range, blizzards howled through every ridge, cutting winds sharp as knives. Caleb Thomas pulled his hat low, leaning forward in the saddle, driving his cattle into the pen before darkness swallowed the valley. He was used to this cold, used to the wind rattling through long nights, used to the silence pressing down inside his lonely cabin. But that night, a sound broke through the storm, heavy, sharp, unfamiliar. A crack of lightning tore the sky above the ridge, followed by the splintering groan of wood and metal. Then nothing. He glanced up, narrowed his eyes into the whiteout, and caught sight of something collapsed on the far slope. Without a thought, he dug his heels into Scout's sides, urging the old horse into the swirling snow. The stagecoach lay on its side, one wheel broken and twisted beneath it, the roof half buried in drifts. The horses were gone, the harness torn loose. In the snow lay a small figure unmoving. A dark blue dress marred with blood, auburn hair tangled and frozen in the wind. She lay there as if she'd given up everything, except for her hands still clutching a leather satchel as though it held her very soul. Caleb swung down, striding through the drift. He crouched low, touching her shoulder. Her skin was ice, but faint breath escaped her pale lips. Light enough in his arms, she felt like a bird with a broken wing. He wrapped her in his own coat, lifted her, and swung back into the saddle. Scout snorted, stomping against the snow, but trudged forward obediently. The road home stretched longer, steeper than he remembered. Snow fell so heavy, it covered his shoulders and seeped into his boots. The wind cut at his face, whipped at old memories he thought he'd buried. He kept one arm around her the whole way, feeling the faint rise and fall of her chest against him. A quiet reminder, don't let her slip away. At last, the cabin came into view through the darkness, a faint glow from the window calling him home. He shouldered through the door, warmth and wood smoke rising to meet him. He laid her gently on the single, narrow bed, peeling away his gloves, his boots, brushing the snow and blood from her tangled hair. She was too slight, too quiet, as if one more gust of wind might take her from him forever. He stoked the fire, higher set water to boil, stripped off his snow-heavy coat. For a moment, he glanced at her again, her fingers still wrapped tight around that battered satchel. Outside, the storm still screamed, burying the path he'd come down. But inside, warmth slowly began to creep back into the room. He sat at the edge of the bed and studied her face. He didn't know her name, or where she'd come from, or what she carried with her. All he knew was this tonight, something inside him, something he thought long dead, had quietly come alive. That night, the wind howled like a pack of wolves. Caleb sat by the fire, the flickering light carving deep lines into his weathered face, his eyes never leaving the woman lying motionless on the bed. Her lips had regained a faint blush, but her breathing was still fragile. her legs stiff and splinted as best he could. He'd done everything he could, washed away the blood-bound, the broken bone with kindling and cloth, laid a warm rag on her forehead. In the kitchen, water boiled quietly, steam curling into the air. The cabin, so cold and empty for years, now smelled faintly of tea, and her presence, something warm, something unfamiliar. All through the night she burned with fever. Her eyes stayed shut, but her lips kept whispering broken, scattered words. Caleb stood over her, catching each one like pieces of a puzzle. Casper. The children. School fund. Didn't take. Sister. Charles. His brow furrowed as he leaned closer. Her frail hands clung tightly to the leather satchel, as if it were her lifeline. He gently eased it from her grip, laying it aside. When her fingers loosened, a few thin envelopes slipped out from its worn seam. He picked one up and held it to the lamplight. A child's clumsy scrawl. Dear teacher, my name is Tommy. I can count to 20 now. Mama says you'd be proud if you came. Will you come teach us? Caleb set it down, staring into the fire. Another letter, shakier handwriting. I've been teaching myself from my daddy's Bible, but I want to learn more. Please don't forget us, teacher. Thin paper, fragile words, yet heavy as stone in his hands. He stacked the letters, carefully tucking them back into the satchel, and looked at the woman again. Even in the storm, she'd clung to those letters, as though they carried not just hope for the children of Casper, but hope for herself. Caleb's hand tightened silent, as though promising her and those unseen children that he wouldn't let her slip away. By morning, the snow still fell thick, sealing the valley shut, but she'd weathered the worst of the fever. Her breathing steadied her skin, no longer clammy. Caleb stood by the window, staring into the white, his mind strangely blank. Yet somewhere deep in his chest, something stirred, faint but undeniable. The cabin didn't feel as quiet as it used to. His fingers brushed the edge of the satchel resting on the table. The letters inside waited for her to wake to answer, just as he, in some quiet corner of himself, had been waiting for something. Anything for a long time. That night, before he blew out the lamp, he glanced at her again. Under the blanket, her eyes fluttered open just for a second, gray-blue and fleeting, before they closed in exhaustion. No words, no questions, just a glance. Enough for him to understand nothing from here on would ever be the same. The days that followed the storm never let up, as if determined to trap everything in that frozen valley. Snow piled higher. Wind screamed through the ridges, burying every trace of the trail outside. Each morning, Caleb rose, swept the drifted snow from his porch, chopped more wood for the fire, tended to the cattle. But his eyes kept straying back to the little room where she lay. Little by little strength returned to her. At first, just a faint blush on her lips. Then, a steadier gaze following his movements quietly. She didn't say much, just lay there, and watched fingers sometimes tightening on the edge of the blanket, as if reminding herself she was still alive. And he didn't ask. One morning, he caught her eyes lingering on the leather satchel. He placed it on the bed. Slowly she opened it, pulled out the stack of worn letters, and smoothed each one as though they were treasure. Caleb stood there, and for the first time saw in her gray-blue eyes something stronger than even the storm outside resolve. She propped herself up, frail hands reaching for a small pen tucked inside. The tip trembled as it touched paper, each stroke slow, deliberate. Caleb drew closer, watching the thin letters appear. Dear Tommy. He realized then his own hand was resting on the chair's back, faintly trembling. Since the war, he hadn't been able to bring himself to read a letter, let alone write one as if words belonged to better men. But now, seeing hers take shape on the page, something restless stirred in him. That evening, after she'd drifted to sleep, Caleb sat at the table. He spread out the children's letters, lit the lamp, picked up a pen. He tried to write one line, then crossed it out. Ink smeared across his fingers. His letters leaned and faltered. Behind him, she shifted in her sleep, her hand still resting lightly on the stack of letters. The next morning, he placed a sheet of paper in front of her. She glanced down, then looked up at him, startled. On the page, in clumsy but clear letters, "Teach me to read." She set the children's letters aside, tilted her head, and gave him a quiet nod. Not a word spoken, but in her eyes was something he thought he'd never see again: trust. In the days that followed, the cabin filled with the sound of halting syllables. Slowly, she guided him through each sound, each word. He was stiff, awkward, but every time he managed to piece a word together, her eyes brightened just a little more, as though she herself was coming back to life through the lines and pages. And for him, it was the first time in years he felt his life could begin again, learning to read, to live, to look into someone else's eyes without flinching from the reflection. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside that small room, with the sound of letters and wind at the windows and warmth from the hearth, a new story was being written, one where he was no longer alone. The storm broke slowly, as though it meant to swallow the whole winter before letting go. When the snow finally began to recede from the trail, the sky was a dull silver, and the trees stood stripped bare, shivering in the wind. Caleb stood on the porch, a cigarette between his fingers, staring into the distance toward town, toward where the children and Casper were waiting for her to return. She could stand now, leaning on his old cane, wrapped in his coat, quietly pacing the cabin. There was resolve in her gray-blue eyes, no complaint on her lips. Every evening before sleep, she still spread the children's letters on the table, reading them, arranging them again as though performing a ritual. And sometimes, as Caleb stood by the window watching her, he wondered when the snow melted for good, she would leave, return to her life, and leave him behind in the silence of this cabin. That night he woke earlier than usual. Something restless had settled in his chest. The cattle in the pen shifted uneasily. Scout pawed at the ground, snorting, picking up the faint smell of something foreign, tobacco smoke. And horses. Hoofbeats crested the hill. Caleb stepped onto the porch, his fingers grazing the rifle by the doorframe. Then he saw him, the man, astride a black horse, wearing a fine eastern coat dulled with road dust beard, trimmed a look of lazy confidence, as though the whole world owed him. Charles Peaton. The man dismounted, drove his riding crop into the snow, dusted off his coat, and let his gaze sweep over the little cabin before settling on Caleb. He smiled faintly. Caleb didn't move. His hand tightened on the stock of the rifle. Charles climbed the porch, slowly, each step deliberate, arrogant. He stopped just shy of the door, casting a glance at the gap in the wood where a hint of auburn hair had just flashed past. No words were needed. Caleb understood. A slow anger coiled in his chest, hot and quiet. Charles stared back at him, eyes cool and mocking, but his voice, when he finally spoke, carried a chill that made the air between them colder still. A threat, unspoken, yet clear. Caleb heard it. The man knew everything: her past in Boston, the accusations, even Caleb's own ghost from Millen, and the warrants that had never been rescinded. And Charles hadn't come just to reclaim her. He'd come to remind them both that shame, like secrets, never stayed buried for long. Caleb watched as Charles turned back toward his horse, his posture the very picture of a man convinced he'd already won. That night she sat by the fire, her eyes lowered, hands trembling as she packed the letters back into her satchel. Caleb stayed a few paces away, silent. The fire cracked in the hearth. Its light played over her face, the face of someone cornered with no way out. She rose, leaning on the cane, the satchel hanging from her arm. He didn't stop her, only watched, his gaze dark and quiet, deeper than the black night outside. And then, in the biting cold, Caleb heard the hoofbeats fading into the hills, carrying her away. And with her, a part of his own heart. 2 days' ride across frozen ridges, Margaret sat behind Charles, clutching the leather satchel, silent. The mountain wind whipped at her hair, auburn strands spilling across her face. He never looked back, only urged his horse north. Under the cold moon, the mining camp of Silver Creek appeared at last, a flickering cluster of lights in a narrow valley, tents and crude cabins huddled together under a thin haze of smoke. It was like every mining town she'd ever seen, hurried, chaotic, full of fragile hope and hidden snares. When Charles finally reined in, a woman stood waiting by the largest tent, beaming at them. Children peeked out from behind her skirts, wide-eyed at the stranger. Margaret dismounted, her legs still weak, leaning on the cane. She looked around, weathered faces, sunburnt and weary, yet full of expectation. Fathers with hands, rough from the mines, mothers clutching babies close, and the children. The very same children whose letters she had read all through the winter. Her throat tightened. Beside her, Charles's low voice came like a blade. "Remember your part. They paid for you. Now earn it." That afternoon, Margaret followed the camp matron as she showed her the proposed school site and recounted stories of saving and sacrifice. A miner proudly introduced his daughter, who had taught herself to read. A young widow held her 3 boys close, saying with tear-bright eyes, "We just want them to have a chance so they won't live and die in the mines, like their fathers." Margaret simply nodded, listening each word, cutting deeper. She knew that in Charles's plan, all this trust, all this hope would vanish, with him leaving only ruins in its place. That night in the small tent Charles had arranged for her, Margaret forced herself to face the mirror. In the dim lamplight, she saw her own face, pale, tired, but her eyes steady now. She laid out the children's letters again, smoothing them one by one. At the edge of the table lay a small pencil, the same one she had used to teach Caleb his first words. She closed her hand around it, feeling its weight, letting it remind her. She remembered his eyes that last night, silent, unwavering, full of trust. And she knew she wouldn't betray that. Later, under the stillness of a sleeping camp, Margaret slipped out of her tent. She moved through narrow alleys between shacks until she reached a small, dimly lit lean-to where an older man sat waiting. His coat bore the tarnished badge of a federal marshal. Margaret set a sealed envelope on the table, her voice low but firm. "Everything I have is here. You just need to do the rest." The marshal looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. No more words were needed. That night, in the cold of Silver Creek, Margaret returned to her tent, still clutching the pencil. Her breath came steady. Her eyes gleamed with quiet determination. This fight was far from over. 3 days later, Silver Creek buzzed with whispers. Word spread through the camp. Government men were in the area, asking about a con man who preyed on desperate families. Charles heard the rumor before anyone else, and as dusk fell, he ordered the horses readied. Margaret knew he planned to flee. That night, under a sky of cold stars, wind sweeping through the canvas roofs, he dragged her toward the horses, her leather satchel still slung on her shoulder like a counterfeit trophy. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp with calculation. In silence, he bound her wrist to the saddle horn, swung onto his horse, and spurred them into the night. They rode through a narrow pass called Dead Man's Gulch, a place of sheer cliffs and twisting dark where the moon hung thin behind streaked clouds, just bright enough to catch the hard glint of his expression. Margaret stayed quiet. Her heart pounded, but her eyes stayed forward, scanning the dark ahead, the tree line, the faint shapes moving at its edges. And then the sound came. Hoofbeats, heavy, fast. From the woods on both sides, riders emerged at once, encircling them, rifles glinting in moonlight. Charles yanked at the reins, wild-eyed, and swung his pistol up. But too late. A single, cutting voice rang out low, commanding Charles Peaton. "Drop the gun! You're surrounded!" He spun in his saddle, panic flashing. The circle tightened. From the darkness in front of him, one rider stepped forward, tall. Silent, his gray eyes catching what little light there was like embers under ash. Caleb. Charles froze, his breath catching in his chest. Margaret turned her head just enough to meet Caleb's gaze. In that moment, without a word, she let him see it, her trust unbroken. Charles snarled and swung his pistol toward Caleb, but a single gunshot cracked from the trees, the bullet tearing through his arm, sending his weapon spinning into the snow. He screamed, clutching his arm as hands seized him, forced him down. The wind howled through the pass, swirling snow and grit carrying the sound of his curses away. Margaret sat still in her saddle, gripping the reins tight, her heart hammering. Caleb rode closer, stopped in front of her. He didn't speak, only held her gaze for a long, quiet moment. Then slowly he reached out his hand. She didn't hesitate. She set her hand in his. That night, in Dead Man's Gulch, as the shouting and struggle faded as they led Charles away into the dark, Margaret sat behind Caleb on his horse, her arms around his waist, letting the cold wind whip through her hair, letting her heartbeat settle against his. That night, she knew she'd chosen the right man to trust. The next morning, snow still dusted the ridges as Caleb brought Margaret back to the cabin. The wind was sharp, but the sky had turned a pale blue, thin clouds breaking to let through a wan winter sun that spilled across the valley. She moved slowly, leaning on his shoulder as she dismounted. The cabin door creaked open and warmth greeted them again, the familiar scent of wood smoke and faint tea. The same place where he'd first carried her through the storm, where she'd first opened her eyes, where letters and hesitant words had been written in firelight. He hung his rifle on the wall, stoked the fire. She sat at the table, removed her gloves, and spread the old letters before her, smoothing each page as though smoothing a child's hair. He stood and watched her, listening to the crackle of the hearth, the quiet rhythm of her breath. After a moment, she looked up. Her eyes no longer held fear, only a soft, steady light. He eased into the chair opposite her, his hand resting near hers, not touching. Then he reached into the drawer, pulled out a small, worn box. He slid it across the table toward her, his gaze deep and still. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside lay a plain gold band, no elaborate design, no gemstones. Just a simple circle catching the firelight as it gleamed quietly. Her eyes met his. He didn't smile, but his voice came low and clear. "If you want to stay, we can start over. Together." Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the band's edge. Her eyes stayed on his. Those gray eyes that had carried war had fled everything and now simply waited. She took a deep breath and nodded. Just once. Slow. Certain. His gaze softened. He took her hand gently and slid the ring onto her finger, where it settled warm and solid against her skin. Outside, the wind swept over the roof, and the sky deepened to a golden winter dusk. But inside the small cabin, a promise had been made without words. Margaret lowered her head, pressing a light kiss to the back of his hand. He closed his fingers over hers, holding onto the warmth she had brought him through the storm, a warmth he would never let go of again. That night, they sat by the fire, neither of them speaking, letting the wind whistle past the door. And in that quiet, they both understood from now on, neither of them would be alone again. Spring came slowly, but it came. The snow melted, revealing soft brown earth, and the first green shoots pushing stubbornly through the frost. Birds returned to perch on bare branches, and pale sunlight spread across the valley. In the little cabin in that valley, Margaret sat at the table, carefully unrolling her drawing. Fine, deliberate pencil lines sketched out a small schoolhouse standing in a meadow, its windows catching the light, a high-peaked roof, and a brass bell suspended above it all. Caleb stepped in, dusting his sleeves after a morning of helping the crew raise the timber frame. He paused behind her eyes, tracing the lines of her plan, before resting his hand gently on her shoulder. No words were needed. In his eyes and her quiet nod, it was clear the school was taking shape. On their wedding day, the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. Neighbors from the town, the mining camp, and distant farms filled the little meadow outside the cabin. Children darted among the crowd skirts and suspenders fluttering. Mothers cradled babies. Fathers stood straighter than usual, all of them watching. Margaret wore a simple dark blue wool dress, a crown of wildflowers resting in her red hair, as she walked slowly toward where Caleb stood waiting. He wore his cleanest shirt, his face weathered and strong, his gray eyes warm. In the scent of cut grass to the sound of birdsong under the cabin's eaves, the preacher's deep voice pronounced them husband and wife. Caleb's hand closed around hers, her ring finger now bearing the plain gold band that caught the sun. As the crowd clapped, she leaned her head against his shoulder, letting the spring wind whip through her dress and sweep away the last bitterness of the past. And then everyone turned to look at the new schoolhouse. The brass bell just mounted gleamed in the sunlight as Caleb and Margaret both grasped the thick rope and pulled together. The bell rang out long and clear, its sound carrying far across the grass and into the distant hills, a promise to the children. The children whooped and ran toward the building, hands raised in welcome. Margaret stood at Caleb's side, his hand clasping hers tightly, his eyes following the children with a faint smile she'd never seen on him before. That day, in what everyone now called McCrae's Landing, the bell didn't just announce a school, it announced a new beginning for everyone who had once stood at the edge of despair. Margaret glanced at Caleb, her eyes shimmering with trust and hope. He simply nodded, his gaze steady. They both knew the school wasn't just for the children. It was their own way of saving themselves. And as the bell rang again, echoing through the spring afternoon, Margaret drew a deep breath and told herself from here their life would be written anew on this ground where winter had once been merciless, and spring had finally arrived. 6 months later, snow was falling again over McCrae's Landing. It blanketed the little schoolhouse, the wooden steps, even the brass bell above. But this time, the snow no longer carried the lonely chill of despair, only the quiet hush of another season beginning. Margaret stood at the cabin window, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other holding the morning's letter. Outside, children chased each other through the snow, laughter ringing through the valley as their parents busied themselves preparing for the town's first Christmas. She breathed in deeply and unfolded the letter. It was from Tommy, the boy, who'd written to her first. "Dear Mrs. McCrae, I finished all the books you told me to read. My teacher says I can start advanced arithmetic now, and if I work hard, maybe I can earn a scholarship to Cheyenne in 4 years. I still think about what you wrote to us, that learning makes us stronger, and believing in each other helps us become better people. I hope your baby grows up knowing those things too. Thank you for not giving up on us." Margaret smiled, tears blurring her vision as she pressed the letter to her chest. Outside, the school bell rang brightly, calling the children in from the yard. She closed the letter, pulled on her coat, and stepped out into the crisp air. Caleb was waiting at the bottom of the steps, a steaming mug of tea in his hand. When he saw her, he tipped his head slightly, that quiet smile on his face, and his eyes drifting to her growing belly. They walked together down the snowy path, past children who darted by giggling toward the school. Inside the classroom glowed warmly walls, lined with maps, shelves stacked neatly with books, rows of desks filled with bright-eyed students. Above the blackboard hung a photograph of the first class at Silver Creek, taken the day Margaret and Caleb came back to rewrite their story. She stepped onto the platform, feeling the hush settle over the room, feeling the laughter, the whispered greetings, the sparkle of young eyes watching her. That evening, when the snow fell heavier, Margaret and Caleb sat by the fire, the lamp casting a golden glow over the little room. She leaned against his shoulder, their fingers intertwined, both of them watching the flames without speaking. Outside, the bell rang faintly in the wind, as though blessing them. And in that quiet moment, Margaret knew every storm had its purpose. Because it was the fiercest storm that had brought her here, to this man, to this school, to the child growing inside her. She whispered almost to herself, "I'll name her Hope." Caleb's hand tightened gently over hers, his gray eyes shining as if to say, "We already have everything we need." Outside, snow kept falling. But inside the little cabin the fire crackled and the children's laughter echoed through the night. A new story had been written, born from the storm, and now finally whole.